So let's talk about 245 to New Xebico. And
Okay,
I know this is a sequel to the Otherland Express. And for me, this
correct.
was perhaps your most Clive Barker story, and also quite possibly your most liminal spaces story, which is a theme that reoccurs in your
Yeah,
work. So, how did this one come about?
I trying to remember. I know I wrote about it in the story notes, but I hope I don't contradict myself. I'm pretty sure it's the one that I wrote. Happened to look out my window one night and see someone standing on a sidewalk, and it looked like they were waiting for a bus, but it's not a bus stop, and that got me on the bus kick. Thinking about buses and stations and transit terminals, and those are liminal spaces by nature. And I use the bus theme in Otherland Express as well, and it just kind of came together like that. It wasn't a conscious decision to you know go very Barker with that story, but it happened that way. Just the idea of being in this space, in this time that's in between other times, and in that space you can do things you normally wouldn't be able to do, like take your skin off and share it with somebody else and trade skins, become somebody else. uh it That's one of my stories that I wish more people had read, the Otherland Express specifically. Got a email from a reader many years ago. This was after the first collection came out, and to tell me that the Otherland Express resonated with them because it was very much like they're a trans person, and it resonated with them because of what the protagonist is going through, why they felt the need to run away and become someone else, essentially. And it struck them that way, and that's something I totally did not have in mind, but I think is awesome. Uh, so having that, you know, that knowledge that some readers perceive it that way, I wanted to lean into it a little bit more. Like, well, I've got this idea that it exists in the same universe as the Nightwire and H.F. Arnold, which to me is one of my all-time favorite short weird stories ever written. Uh, Big influence on me, and it's not one that many people know about. So Xebico, something happens to Xebico in that story, the Nightwire. So let's say there's a new Xebico and the other lands. It's this a liminal state and a liminal country and a liminal space, and people can go there and they can, shed their identities and take on other identities. And here you have this guy who actually works in a bus terminal encountering someone who was, transiting from one reality to another. And, I don't even remember where I came up with the whole, uh, the, daylight savings time, mechanic, but it might have been something. It might have been a Twilight Zone episode, not the old Twilight Zone, but the new Twilight Zone. I say new in quotations. That it was like in the early '90s. The new Twilight Zone. There was like a Twilight Zone episode where somebody had like all the time had been saved up in this watch, and they could use this time however they wanted, like a resource. Kind of came from that. Very strange story. Uh, it I wrote that for one of Nightscape Press's anthologies, which, you know, sadly I don't think they're around anymore. Which might be for the best. Um, yeah. What else would you like to know about it? Because I'm running on steam here.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to think if Nightscape Press does or doesn't exist right now. You
There
know,
is some fulfillment issues with a lot of people ordering that John Paget and Matthew Bartlett box set that turned out to not be a box set, just a bunch of books they would mail you if you were lucky enough to get the books.
right? This
All
is
sorts of weird fiction community drama happening there, so that I do not want to get into. But yeah, Nightscape. Don't know if they're still around. I hope so they can send out the books they still owe people.
yeah, this is something that I'm very ignorant of. I mean, I used to have like quite a lot of conversations with the people at Nightscape, but then when I got off Facebook, that was my main kind of
Yeah, for
way of
sure.
talking to them. So,
I don't even know if you want to include that part of the conversation, really, because it's just a hornet's nest.
right, right. And I mean, we didn't plan it this way, but it's interesting how in you talking about your story, 245 to New Xebico, it also fits into your philosophy in terms of what might happen after death. Like they're perfectly
Yeah,
linked there, and yeah, serendipitous timing.
yeah. The concept of liminality is something that has definitely shaped my adulthood and the way I look at things in the world.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I can see it looking at us. I want to jump into Happy Town Yuletide Massacre. I
Okay.
really do. I want to go there, and like for me it was kind of like a rom-com
Uh
meets
huh.
Shirley Jackson's The Lottery meets Battle Royale. And then I saw after when I was reading the story notes that it was a dark Hallmark holiday story for a Gabino
Yeah.
Iglesias call.
It
And I thought, well,
was.
yeah,
It was.
yeah.
I wrote it. I scrambled to write that story the last week before deadline. I sent it to him like an hour before it was due, and he never fucking got it. He never got it, which is fine. I figured, okay, I'll keep this, on hand, and if another open call comes up that it fits, then great. If not, I'll put it in my next collection whenever that is. And here we are. Um, it's one of my favorite stories of the bunch, just because it's fun to read aloud. When I was touring last year for the book, that's the story that I read, and it. I would read up to the part where she encounters the boyfriend, the ex-boyfriend, in the bakery, and there's that line where he screams at her, "I didn't kill all these people just to end up a bachelor, Angie." That's where I would stop, and I would just like belt out as loud as possible. And it's really fun to do that in a Barnes and Noble when other people are just shopping. It's great. um, yeah, there's just it was written quickly, and I wanted to do a Legatian kind of spin on the the Hallmark Christmas film. And the Christmas films always have the same plot when you boil them down. It's about, girl coming home, small town, falling in love with some dude who wears flannel, and they live happily ever after. Well, what if it's the same thing repeating over and over again, and eventually they start to get wise and catch on, like, oh, who's she going to fall in love with this year? Well, it's going to be me, motherfucker. I'll kill the rest of you to make sure it's me. And that's how Happy Town came to be. The Happy Town name was that's a Legatian thing, kind of like I was really into his story, The Town Manager, at the time, and there's a reference like where the town manager changes the name of this one place to Baby Town, and everybody's got to dress up like a baby. Uh, Happy Town. I needed a generic, fun name, and that's where that came to be. And yeah, it's always I was surprised that people like that one so much because of the way it ends. It's such an odd, out of left field ending when you realize what's really going on. But yeah, it's just a fun story, man. I had a lot of fun writing it, and I love reading it to people.
Yeah, I think it probably is so kind of effective because, as you say, it's very fun. It's very light in places,
Mm-hmm.
though if you dig a bit deeper, it's not so light. But I think as well, because as you said, it comes out of left field. You're not expecting that after New Xebico, after Midnight in the
Uh
Southlands.
huh.
Um, and then Y2K comes after, which is totally bloody different. So yeah, I think it was a real standout. But then it's not out of place. I mean, there's that playfulness in Black Friday. There's the playfulness in Tommy the Destructo Bot. There are definite commonalities with the Smile Factory as well, which in turn has thematic similarities to Happy Pills. But yeah, there's something about Happy Town Yuletide Massacre. That title as well. Oh my god.
I had the title before anything else.
Yeah.
Yeah, I try to have a title before I start working on it, just to kind of, and that was just my placeholder title. I didn't think that was going to be final, but it was kind of my guidepost with the story, and like, okay, so how far do you want to go, Todd? Like, well, let's see where the story wants to go.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, in a way, it's a crying shame that Gabino didn't get it because, I mean, I'm not familiar with this Dark Hallmark Holiday Stories anthology, but I
It's
can't
fine.
think of a more perfect story. But then I suppose the magic is that this now makes it one of the original stories in your collection.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, because you said, how far did you want to go? I'm gonna just jump to another story rather than doing them sequentially.
Okay.
The Gods of Our Fathers.
Uh huh.
Did you ever feel that you might have gone too far while writing this?
Uh, no. I walked right up to that line.
Yeah.
And that was a story that where like I was in the middle of writing Devil's Creek when I wrote that. And that's why a lot of the language and themes and imagery are similar. And it does exist in that universe. I should mention that there's actually a pseudo sequel story to it that called The Puppeteer of Samhain that was released in October Screams anthology last year. So that'll end up in a collection somewhere down the road. But I was in the midst of writing Devil's Creek, and I got invited to write a story for an anthology that Joe at Crystal Lake was putting together. And what ended up happening, like something I don't know if he messed up his schedule or overcommitted or what, but the anthology just never ended up happening. And I submitted it to Silver Shamrock's, anthology, Midnight in the Pentagram. And that's one of those stories where I realized I was dealing with some really dark subject matter. And it was something that I didn't feel comfortable in exploring, like full frontal. And, if we're talking like in movie terms, I didn't want to take the camera and shove it right into stuff that's happening. So the working title for that story was God Looked Away. And in some ways I, kind of played around with that with the narrative. We don't actually see what happens. I didn't want to go and be very clinical and, go there specifically. But for me, it was me kind of realizing, okay, I don't feel comfortable with this if we go beyond this point. I didn't want to, I try to be tasteful when it comes to, themes like that and, images like that. I tried to be that way in Devil's Creek. I always try to, be mindful that not everybody can handle that. Even where I took it, people can't handle that. So that hesitation to walk up to the line and not cross it is probably one of the reasons why I don't consider myself an extreme horror author or, splatterpunk author. Cause like, to me, like an extreme writer would go that extra step. And I don't feel comfortable doing that. So it was also one of those narrative challenges where I knew where I wanted to end up, but that has to be earned with the reader. So what's going to happen to these other people, these villain characters, has to be justified. So the reader needs to hate them. And that's one of those situations where, okay, so how do I make them hate them that makes sense contextually within the scope of this story? And yeah, unfortunately that involved little Mary sacrificing Oates the goat. And it also involved her brother, essentially raping her. That's not a comfortable thing. I didn't take pleasure in writing it. But it's something that it was the only way I saw forward as a storyteller to justify what happens to the brother at the end of that story.
Yeah, and in terms of knowing, the lines that you will and won't cross, I mean, are there any hard lines that you apply to all of your writing, or is it purely a case by case because you've got to look at what that story demands?
Yeah, it's definitely a case by case, but I'm comfortable in saying that, there are certain things I don't like writing about. And, I don't want to describe sexual assault if I can help it. I don't want to give you the clinical details of what's, clinical play by play of how that's happening. That's not necessary. But I, like with Devil's Creek and the Cemetery Dance edition, I wrote a author's note that lists out the trigger warnings, and there's pedophilia in that book, but it's off screen. It's not happening right in the narrative. You're not walking through the guy's mind while he's doing it to them. It's just something that you find out has happened or is happening elsewhere. For me, that's the line. I don't need to show you the character in the act of doing this horrible thing to someone to get the point across that it's something that they do, you know? So yeah, like sexual assault, I don't really want to describe that. I, don't want to, anything that feels mean spirited, really. Like if I'm just doing that to piss off the reader, like I don't want to do that. I like there to be a narrative reason for something to be in the story, even if it's blood and guts. If it's the nature of a monster to tear people apart and what have you, then okay, cool. But if this monster's human and it preys on other humans, then I have to be delicate with it. because again, we all have our triggers. I have mine. There's, it's like the same with people who aren't don't like to see a movie or read a book where the dog dies. I've found, especially since being a diehard cat owner, I don't like seeing violence toward cats. And I say this as someone whose first novel involves a cat being killed. And I got hate mail for that for years. Rightfully so. So, I don't want to harm animals. In my books, I don't want to, do that, but I also don't want to, give listeners the idea that I'm, going to shy away from bad, tough topics either. I just think there's a tasteful way of handling them. And I try to do that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, and I think you do it successfully. And I mean, you mentioned the trigger warnings in the book, and we don't need to really get into a debate on trigger warnings, but I mean, it seems to be that the main uh, good intentioned, I suppose, opposition to trigger warnings is fear of spoilers, but the way that you handle it is that there's a section at the end. You can turn to it if you want, and then it's there for people who want trigger warnings. If you don't want them, then you never have to turn to that page. And so that seems like the kind of perfect solution, really.
A criticism I've received for that hasn't been because I included it, but because I didn't go into enough detail with the trigger warnings. Which, if that's fine. If, somebody felt that I missed something, that's on me. I'll own it. It's, I can't account for every little thing that somebody's going to be triggered by, especially if it's outside my own experience. I mean, I try to be knowledgeable, but I'm also a human being. I'm going to fuck up or miss something. That's just the nature of it. Yeah, I think the trigger warning debate is silly. I mean, it's it's a rating system. It's a rating system for books, just like movies. And the thing is that it's entirely optional. The author can choose not to do it. I personally choose to do it for everything going forward, because it's, there's no harm in including it. There's no harm, in a reader being prepared. I wouldn't want to read something, for perfect example, I watched a movie a few nights ago that I went into it thinking it was one thing and ended up it being this whole discussion about mental health in impoverished areas, and it really triggered me, in unexpected ways. And I wasn't okay with it because, it's not like the description of the film was misleading. It had nothing to do with any of that. So there's no harm in being informed, and there's no harm in putting the information out there for people if they choose to be informed. And I just, at the end of the day, I write to entertain people. I don't want to hurt my readers. I don't want them to, be hurt by something I've written. It's a story. It's a piece of fiction. You're reading it to enjoy it. If you're not enjoying it, then I failed in my job. So, I'm pro trigger warnings. And, the folks who don't like trigger warnings, well, don't fucking read my books. I don't know.
Yeah, well, you don't even have to not read the book. You just literally don't have to read that one very specific section, which is why the debate is so silly.
Yeah.
And why we'll move on to Y2K. And I mean, you said that you had in the story notes some difficulty initially writing this one, but it
Oh yeah.
was Bjorn Langen, of all people, who reignited your creative flame. So
Right? Can you believe that?
I
Langan
know,
of
I
all
know.
people. Um, yeah. Uh, it. I was writing that story at a time when when my last corporate job came to an end, and my life was suddenly, in upheaval because now I have no income. How do I make this work? What the hell am I going to do? That sort of thing. It was that panic period of, oh my God, I don't have a job. How am I going to survive? And, before it really hit me, hey, this is an opportunity. This isn't a bad thing. This is a good thing. So I was in that ensuing pit of, poor mental health, and I was struggling to just get words down. And the story in my mind was much more grandiose, and it had a bigger scope, and it was going to be third person, and it wasn't working. So I finally just started writing dialogue, because dialogue has always come easier for me than narrative. And I just started writing some dialogue and figured, okay, I'll fill in the narrative later. Just, it's two people having a conversation. And then one night I was trying to get myself in the right headspace to work on it, and I, pulled out John's collection, The Wide Carnivorous Sky, and he's got that story in there, Technicolor, which, if you haven't read Technicolor or listened to it, like, Pseudopod did a fantastic recording of it a year or two ago. Technicolor is basically a professor's lecture about Edgar Allan Poe's The Mask of the Red Death. But there's a story that's unfolding during the lecture. And the way he approached the story, obviously it looked so easy. He made it look so easy. Like, well, I'm not sure if I'm going to go all in on it just being an entirely one big piece of dialogue, but, I can definitely, that gave me the confidence to tell the story only in dialogue. And that's really how Y2K happened. Like, I was writing that story for a Jim Chambers anthology, alternate histories of the Yellow Sign. And Jim had approached me about writing for it. The concept was, in the story, The Repairer of Reputations, there's a glimpse of an America that is vastly different to what we know now. And so I approached it in a modern setting, semi-modern, because it takes place on New Year's Eve, 1999. Y2K crisis. What if that version of America, but in modern day? What would that look like? And what if the Yellow King, the King in Yellow, excuse me, the play is still banned? And what if there was some truth to what happens in the Repair of Reputations? And then you got the decommissioned, suicide bays they have Times Square and stuff. And it was just this mishmash of ideas that all kind of came together. And I couldn't tell that story any other way but by it being a transcript of audio. If I had stuck with my original plan, it would have never been written.
And I know that you said that even after completing writing it, you didn't feel great towards it. So I'm wondering, now with the passage of time and with the favorable response, has your own reaction or your own feelings towards your story
Uh,
changed?
I like the ideas in it. I like the picture that's painted of that alternate reality, alternate United States. It's not one of my strongest stories writing wise. I know I'm doing a great job of selling the collection right now, but like I'm also my own worst critic. I expect everybody to hate everything I write. Uh, Jim loved it, and Jim, bless you, man. I really did email him and say I'm submitting this, and I apologize in advance. And but he loved it. It worked, and he invited me back for another anthology that just got announced through Hippocampus. This one is about House on the Borderland, William Hope Hodgson, and so he asked me to write something for that. And again, I apologized to him when I sent it in. That story, I don't know when that book's getting released, but my story will be in there. It's called Little House on the Borderland, and it's fucking weird as hell. And I had a lot of fun writing it, though.
You often, when you submit stories, apologize in advance, or is this just treatment that Jim
Oh
specifically
no, like I
gets?
apologized to him because like I felt that Y2K was subpar for me. And so, but it's all I had to give him. And he had minimal notes on it. And, I was afraid that he had this expectation he was going to get this. And here I am coming in with this. And, that I felt I needed to preface it with an apology. But, you know, it obviously I am a horrible, horrible, critic of myself. And I, can't guess who's going to like what. Really, I'm a bad judge of that. So, I mean, again, like I've warmed to it, especially since readers have enjoyed it, have said they've enjoyed it. But at the time, yeah, I thought my career was done. This is it. This is where I stop.
Right, right. Yeah, I think a lot of us deal with similar thoughts from time to time. And in fact, this does lend itself rather nicely to a question that we've got from Tracy Kenworth via Patreon. And she wants to know, how do you deal with imposter syndrome? And as a kind of addition to that, I mean, if it's not that you deal with it as such, I suppose, how do you navigate it, or how do you continue in spite of it?
My relationship with imposter syndrome has changed over the years. Like I still have it, don't get me wrong. Every story, no matter how long or short, I still have that point where I'm like, they're gonna figure out that I'm not who, I've presented myself to be, and I don't belong here, and I'm just gonna fade away and nobody's gonna remember my name or something like that. I go through that with everything. And honestly, I've come to accept that it is a part of the process. I feel like that, we treat it like something that shouldn't be there, but the thing is that in my experience, it's always there. And for me, it is part of the process. It's something where I kind of recognize it. I've been doing this long enough that I know what it is when it happens. And I'm like, at the end of the day, it's like, I'll give myself a day to kind of shake it off, consume other media, do something else other than write. And the next day I get up and I keep going. Uh, so, and that's really what it boils down to in the essence of the matter. It's like, well, yeah, you're always gonna, it's in our nature to put ourselves in comparison to others. That's just what we as humans do, for better or worse. Like I was on a stage with Paul Tremblay a few weeks ago, for fuck's sake, dropping the most unexpected and effective diss of 2024. But that's not what this conversation's about. uh, it's every time I'm on a panel with people, it's always people that I hold to, in my mind, they're so much higher up the chain than I am. And there's always this need to put people in a hierarchy, but at the end of the fucking day, we're just co-workers. We're people who work in the same industry. My camera's gone blurry again. We're people who work in the same industry, and they're going through it just as much as, I am. Hold on one second, guys. Alexa, turn on Todd's lamp. There we go.
There you go. Alexa is listening,
yeah.
and we've got rid of the blur.
I got tired of fighting with the camera.
Yeah.
We're co-workers, essentially. We work in the same industry. They're dealing with imposter syndrome just as much as you are. And, I don't have a bulletproof solution for how do you get around it. It's more just, it goes back to that element of spite. You're going to keep going even if, oh, nobody's going to care what you're writing. Well, actually, that's actually a good thing. Now you're free to tell your story however you want. It doesn't matter what people think. Because no one's going to read it. But then, you tell yourself that, and that, again, that's freeing. To me, I find that freeing. And I always try to change perspective on things like that. So, yeah, on one hand, what the fuck am I doing at a lectern with Paul Tremblay? But at the same time, we both write horror in a field. We're both professionals. Why aren't we up on the same lectern, at the same lectern together? And I always think about, this interview that Trent Reznor did with MTV back in the day, talking about touring with David Bowie. And he's talking, I don't remember word for word, but the essence was, there was that imposter syndrome because David Bowie was one of his heroes growing up, and suddenly he's sharing a stage with him. And it's just that epiphany of like, oh my God, I'm on stage with David Bowie. And those who know me and those, listeners of the last time I was on the show know that, Nine Inch Nails is a huge influence to me. So if Trent fucking Reznor has imposter syndrome, I mean, come on. If he has it and still does his thing, then, why can't I? Why can't you? Yeah, it's a very rambling answer to a very simple question, but at the end of the day, imposter syndrome is something that I think we should embrace as part of the process and accept it. It's something that's going to happen. Deal with it however you need to deal with it in your own way, and then keep going. I don't really have a better answer than that, I think.
It's a very good answer. And, I find it liberating when I hear about people like Trent Reznor having imposter syndrome. And I remember one of the first times we spoke to Paul Tremblay, him talking about sometimes having self-doubt and things, in that region. So it feels like, I mean, goodness, even Dean Koontz has said similar things. So
Like,
it's freeing to know that, it will almost always be there. For some people, it would be depressing, but for me, it's freeing.
yeah, it comes down to, how do you figuring out your own process and how do you approach things and how do you, handle things. It's very personal. We're all different. Every writer has a different process. But one thing comes to mind now that I think about it. This was years ago. Facebook. I had just come back from Nikon and I had Gemma Files' book Experimental Film. And I had posted something about it, and Peter Straub commented because I had tagged Gemma in the post. He commented just something really short, like "Now we're talking" or something like that. Never met Peter, never got the chance to meet him before he passed on, unfortunately. But I was like texting my editor Amelia, and I'm like freaking out. Like Peter fucking Straub just like responded to my post about Gemma Files, and she's like, she just said it so simply, like he's just a guy, and she's right. You know, we're just people. Like these, we idealize people that are doing things we love so much that we forget that they're human beings, and they, you know, they burp and fart just like we do. You know, like there's of all the things I would ask Stephen King, I think it would be just like, you know, when do you sleep? Like, how often do you sleep? Like, how many hours do you sleep? Like, I would love to ask Stephen King that because he's a machine.
Well, there you go. If we
You know, there's
ever
so
get
many
him on the
practical,
podcast, I'll ask
like,
him for you.
yeah, thanks.
Let's
There's
find
so
out.
many practical questions to ask somebody rather than why do you write horror or
Yeah.
what got you in the industry or anything like that. I would just be like, so how do you manage this? You know, how did you learn? What advice would you have for how to manage this or this or this? And, you know, I'm sure Stephen King has imposter syndrome too. Like, I don't know if it's ingrained in us to think that we aren't deserving of where we are because there's this mentality of, you know, we've been taught and raised to always be striving for something better.
Mm.
And go ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned King and imposter syndrome, and I think we know for a fact that he at least did have it because, as I recall, didn't he throw Carrie in the
Yeah,
trash, and
yeah,
it was his
mm-hmm.
wife Tabitha who,
Yeah.
saved it.
That's a famous story. He didn't think he was, you know, the right person to tell that story. He didn't think he had the right perspective because he wasn't a teenage girl. So yeah, like everybody that you think is above this has the same issues like that you do. So yeah, just I would say come to understand that and, you know, take hold of it and don't let it go. Like everybody else is also afraid of failing.
I know that you were going to jump in with something there, Bob, but I interrupted you.
Yeah, and now I lost the tangent. But hey, I do feel that we need to learn how to embrace things that scare us when it comes to the actual mechanics of writing. And sometimes those things are hard to embrace.
Yeah.
Um, Imposter syndrome has caused me to abandon projects because you figure, oh, well, this is like the dumbest idea I've ever come up with, and it's too similar to this. They did it better. Um, and then, I feel that like there's a couple of projects that I've abandoned that maybe I regret abandoning them. Maybe I can bring them back from the dead because they are a part of me, and I'm the only one who can tell that story.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so I've dealt with it, and that's usually how I deal with it. I'm getting better at it. I don't like abandoning projects because I don't feel that I'm worthy of the task. It's like, why the fuck write to begin with at that
Yeah.
point? And I'm compelled to write because I want to create. I love telling stories.
Yeah.
And if I put it out there, I'm going to have the same feelings I have every time, which is, I think that it's a common thread. We're just, everyone's going to hate it. As I've gotten older, I've kind of learned that if somebody hates something, I'm probably going to like it.
Yeah.
I love polarizing stuff. So if you've got enough, if you've had enough of a project that where if you've read a book or seen a movie and you hate it so much, do you actually have to tell people how much you hate it? I'm going to like it. I'm probably going to like it a lot.
It's always good. I mean, if they hate it, then you made them feel something. Then you didn't fail. You know, it's not the positive, response you're hoping for. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because their response is their problem.
Right.
You know, it doesn't affect you. It doesn't affect, what you write, how you write. Yeah.
Yeah.
So on the topic of, even writing stories that, or that they're too similar to something else that somebody else more successful wrote or something, like, yeah, like I thought of that when I was writing Devil's Creek, like we're writing a small town horror story. Wow, that's never been fucking done before. I'm heavily influenced by Stephen King. Well, Stephen King's written like 10 of those. But Stephen King hasn't written that story. And no one else could tell that story but me. And so, like, you mentioned Black Friday, my story Black Friday in the collection. That was one of those where, it's a zombie story in a retail setting. That's never been done before, right? Huge fan of George Romero and, his original Dead trilogy. And I feel like I try not to write certain tropes that have been done to death. That's why I've never done a vampire story. I'm not saying I never will. All the ideas I have for those sorts of things have been done. And I like to at least come up with an angle that is unique, to me at least. And Black Friday was one of those situations where, I had a lot of friends that I worked with at my job at Staples, which is an office supply store here in the States. And that was my first job out of college. My first job when I moved to Pennsylvania. And we had a lot of, interesting customers. And working Black Friday that year, it's hard not to imagine shoppers as a horde of mindless, cannibals. And of course it's been done, but has it been done in an office supply store before? Has it been done with, it starting with an infected Santa Claus at a retail office supply store? It's kind of like one of those things. It's like, well, it doesn't matter if it's too similar to something else. It's the one thing that's different is you and your perspective. And that's what no one else has, is your perspective. So what if, somebody more successful or popular is writing the same kind of story? They're not writing your story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's
a standout story for me.
Really?
Oh yeah, I completely related. I completely related to Black Friday. I have worked. I've been in retail for goddamn 30 years of my life. I have worked every fucking Black Friday ever. So I know I've worked with managers. We had a vehicle drive into our store and the district manager would not close the store. He says, "Nope, clean up the mess, lower the gate. We'll have someone come by and fix the window tonight, and 2 of y'all are going to have to stay."
Wow.
So we stayed till midnight so some old guy could drive up in a truck and put a piece of fucking plywood up.
Man, late stage capitalism, am I right?
Oh yeah. And so I relate to that story so much. Just now I've got these images in my head on Black Friday whenever people start to like really, really clamor into the store. And I'm going to go, man, what if these people were zombies? What would I do? I'd start killing. Well, I mean, they'd have to be zombies, but yeah.
In
But yeah, I totally
fiction,
get it.
NSA, in fiction.
It's just just dealing with people just like no matter what they want to come in. It's like you don't even need this shit. And really and truly, if you think about it on Black Friday, I mean, this is my last little bit on that. You really want to deal? Wait till February when they put the shit on clearance.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I read Black Friday, I thought this has got to come from years of pent up frustration working in retail. And then when I read the story notes, and it's like, 1 month of Staples did this to you? It's like, man.
Yeah. It was also written. I included a lot of personalities that I worked with, and
Yeah.
it's an old story too. That's 2007, 2008 when I originally wrote that, and it sat in a folder for years because it was too long, and till there was this I forget the name of the press. I want to say Grinning Skull. They do a charity anthology every year. The Bethlehem series, and I saw the call for that, and I'm like, you know what? It's been sitting dormant for years. Fuck it, I'll send it in for charity. And they accepted it, and that was the first time it got printed, like, almost 10 years after I wrote it.
Yeah, it's weird how sometimes that is just the way that it plays out. But I mean, I wonder if there's a call for an anthology and then you know that you have a story on your hard drive that's, let's say, a decade old. Before you submit it, do you reread it? Do
Oh,
you
of course.
reproof it? Or
Oh, God, yeah.
like, I mean, that's what I do. Like, I will reread it and make sure that, I'm comfortable with it. But I can see the danger is that, as we said, you can't write the same story twice. So if you're not careful, you're going to want to tinker with it and change it completely. And then you might lose some of the essence.
The thing that I changed most about the draft before I sent it in, it used to jump around a lot between perspectives, and it was very non-linear. It's kind of like the guy's remembering it, but he's under a lot of stress, obviously, and he's just kind of writing things down as he remembers them, and they're all out of sequence. Well, I basically did away with that and made it a linear story rather than have it jump around. That's really the main thing I changed about it. Like, I didn't really, of course, I cleaned it up. I tightened up some of the language, but I didn't, alter the story in any way other than that. So yeah, like they accepted it. So
There you go.
always
And
a good feeling.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, Tommy the Destructo Bot, which follows Black Friday. I mean, this is a similarly fun story. I think this is up there with just these like kind of fantastical imaginings. I mean, essentially, imagine if you could get your revenge upon all of those bullies and live out your dream of becoming a robot.
Yeah, that's probably one of the weirdest stories I've ever written. I wrote it for my friend Mercedes Yardley because we had this agreement early on in our friendship that we would write the other into a story in some form or fashion. She wrote a story. I forget the title of it. But she wrote a story in which I was dead from the start. Like I was just a body. And I started my story because I really wanted to capture the kind of the whimsical essence of her fiction and, her stories. So I kind of wanted to do that in the nature of the story, but then it became this whole other thing, and I didn't finish it. I put that one away, thinking, okay, this is too weird for me. I wasn't ready to write it at the time. So I put it away for several years, and finally, after I finish a story, I kind of go back and look at my files and see, okay, what do I have? Do I have anything that's kind of like half finished, so I don't have to like start from scratch on something because I'm lazy? And, that's, I had a chunk of the story written, and it picked it up from there. Tightened up the language again and finished the rest of the story, and it became this weird, whimsically violent tale of comic book, fantasy. And yeah, that was also it. It was a combination of being fun to write, but also difficult to write. Just because of the nature of it, like I wanted I wanted to catch the reader off guard with some of the violence. I wanted to kind of it comes out of nowhere. So I was, just experimenting, and really, I should say that all these stories were experiments. They, it's me having an idea and also thinking, okay, well, how can I tell this that I haven't done before, or is this a topic I haven't written about before? Those are things that I consider when I'm choosing projects to work on.
Yeah, and I imagine that this must have been one of the longest short stories to write in terms of, how long it took you, because you said that, from initial idea to getting it out there was about 6 years.
Yeah, I tend to stew on my stories a lot. I work, even though I wrote Devil's Creek's first draft in like 18 months, I was kicking around that idea, for the better part of 12 years. And, it had 2 false starts, in that time. And it's really just a matter of, figuring out what you're ready to write or not. Maybe you're writing and it doesn't feel right, and you like the idea, but it's not there yet. It needs more time to percolate. Or maybe you're not in the right headspace to be writing that story at that point in time. Doesn't mean it's bad, doesn't mean what you've written is bad. It just means that it's not ready yet. So, in my experience, like a lot of my short stories are stories that I've started years ago and, have picked up later on. Same goes for novels. The novel that just sold, The Sundowners Dance, began as a short story. It was for a period of time going to be something I co-authored with Chad Lutsky, but, I just can't work. I can't work alongside somebody else. I'm too much of a control freak, I guess. So we shelved that, and then I picked up my original work before he came on board, and started writing a little bit more, realized it was going to be something long form, and stopped because I didn't want to write long form stuff, because again, this was after Devil's Creek. And, I got invited to an anthology a couple of years ago, and, if I looked at that story that was unfinished and thought, okay, if I can slim this down, then it'll work. But that my attempts at making it shorter failed tremendously, and so I just kept going with it, and it eventually became the novel that we just sold. So, all told, that story has been alive in my head since like 2018. So that's just part of my process. I'm envious of people who can just crank things out constantly. I wish I could do that, but I'm not that kind of writer.
There you go, Josh Malerman and Stephen Graham Jones. That is
I
personal comment.
envy their work ethic and their energy. God
Yeah.
envy their energy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean Josh Malaman, his literal energy is probably only equaled by Clay McLeod Chapman, who you
Right?
mentioned before. Clay McLeod Chapman, man, that is what the kids would call a vibe. That man is a vibe.
He is a force of nature.
Mm-hmm.
Like being in the same room at a con with him, and when he does his TikTok thing where he just runs around screaming, like everything stops for that. Like everybody stops doing what they're doing and cheers him on. Like he ran a full lap around the ballroom at AuthorCon this year. That was nuts. And yet when you talk to him 101, he's a very soft spoken guy. He's very calm. And, I love Clay to death. He's a sweet soul. And I just wish I could eat his brain and consume all that energy and knowledge. I don't mean that literally. I wouldn't actually eat his brain. You can get a disease from that.
But there could be a future short story in that.
Oh yeah, totally. I ate Clay McLeod Chapman's brain.
I mean, it's a good story
A love
title.
story.
A love story.
A love story.
Yeah. A horrormance.
Oh, yeah. Well, we're coming up to the time that we have together today, but I mean, I do hope that this has really piqued our listeners and viewers' interest in terms of your collection, and it also shows just the breadth of stories that you've written. But I mean, we haven't even really touched on, I mean, there's a lot of more Legottian things towards the kind of second half of this collection. Particularly, we've all gone to Crooked Town, and then we've all gone to the Magic Show, which are connected.
Yeah, there's a little bit of everything in there for everyone. Whatever your flavor of horror is, you're going to find something that you'll like. Or at least I hope you do.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, the Smile Factory as well. If people enjoyed your critique on, you know, retail and commercialism in Black Friday, then boy, oh boy, do you have something to say about corporate life and office culture in that one.
That I originally just released that on my own as a novelette, and just like a short little chapbook, and I had an epigraph at the beginning that says, "Hell is a prison of metaphors. This one is mine." I was working in corporate, had been working in corporate for the better part of a decade when I wrote that, and the way I pitched it to people at events in the past, they kind of pick it up because it had a really weird, eye-catching cover, and they pick it up and look at it, and I just tell them, have you ever worked at a job you hate? Like, then you might, connect with that story, and that still applies. Like that story is my treatise on corporate America.
Yeah.
It's very valid.
Thank you.
I envy the person who, you say to them, have you ever worked a job that you hate? And they're like, no, I can't possibly relate to that. It's like, well, you're a lucky
I don't think anyone has
motherfucker.
ever said, no, I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. And the audacity of your boss at the time asking you to smile more, it's like, come on, give me something to smile about, and maybe you'll get a smile.
Like, just the audacity of asking that question, and you're making people uncomfortable because you don't smile enough. Fuck you. Fuck all the way off. Continue fucking off when you get there, all the way into the sun. Just fuck off forever.
It was very tempting to cut the episode there, because then we'd have part 1 and part 2 end with telling people to fuck off. But I would be remiss if I didn't ask where our listeners and viewers can connect with you.
Sure. I have my website, toddkeisling.com. I am back on Twitter for the time being. I refuse to call it by its other name, at Todd_Keisling. I'm on Blue Sky, at Todd Keisling, Instagram, at Todd Keisling. You might see a theme here. Yeah, like I'm pretty much on most social network platforms. I'm on TikTok, even though I don't use it that much. I'm not comfortable really with the idea of making constant videos of myself doing stupid things or talking about things because I'm not that interesting. I'm just a guy who sits in the dark.